We're all human. We all have favorites and least favorites, and that also applies to A Song of Ice and Fire author George R. R. Martin. In the past, I've discussed his favorite families in Westeros, which he's talked about a bit in interviews as well. What he hasn't talked about are his least favorite houses, those families that he really doesn't particularly care for or is comfortable putting on the wrong side of every given conflict in the entirety of the series. I don't think he hates any particular family, but there are definitely those groups that he has more comfort just putting in a villainous role throughout the story. I think this has evolved over time, but today I want to take a look at 7 houses in particular that I think are George Martin's least favorite in A Song of Ice and Fire. I want to start off with an honorable mention of sorts, one that I think was maybe intended to be super villainous and maybe was one of Martin's lesser favorite houses, but ended up growing, thanks to his Gardner writing style, into one of the best and seemingly one of his favorites, that being House Lannister. If we look back at the original outline for the series, this letter that we have from I think 1991 or 1992 that outlines the events of A Song of Ice and Fire as Martin originally envisioned as a trilogy, we see the Lannisters being cast in a much more concretely black and white villainous light. They are very much villains in the modern series. Everyone except the sweet angel baby Tommen and Marcella are pretty evil in at least one sense or another, but they're kind of beyond the pale in this letter. Jaime ascends to the throne by way of killing everyone ahead of him in the line of succession, which assumedly would include his own kids, even if they're not publicly his kids. And additionally, even Tyrion Lannister, the author's favorite character to write, was initially intended to burn down Winterfell, as Ramsay Bolton does in the series proper. So they have definitely grown out of this initial villainous inception, but the Lannisters did very much have kind of their roots in this space. I'll start out the list proper with one that I have addressed in the past before. I had a past thumbnail that says, GRRM hates House Rosby, and that does seem to kind of be the case. House Rosby, for those who don't know, were a small family in the Crown Lands. They didn't appear in the HBO adaptation. We did see a bunch of their shields in the second season of House of the Dragon during this Rook's Rest campaign that Kristen Cole goes on, but they just have a historically unlucky series of decisions throughout the entirety of the history of Ice and Fire. If you look at any given conflict, they are going to be choosing not necessarily the wrong side in terms of what Martin believes, but definitely the losing side and the side that ends up having more damage done in the end. The funniest example of which is the Dance of the Dragons, where they end up switching sides like 3 times and getting punished each time they do. Additionally, members of this house tend to have kind of shared physical traits, which we'll get into with some of these other families coming up here in a little bit, but specifically the Rosbys are known to be kind of frail and kind of sickly. Giles Rosby, the main guy who's on screen as kind of the head of household for this family, is constantly coughing to the point that it is just kind of comedic relief throughout A Feast for Crows. It's pretty great. And additionally, we have the Rosby Freys, who are all said to be fairly slight in build, even compared to other Freys. So I don't think Martin necessarily hates them, as that thumbnail entails, but I do think they get unlucky a lot. Another one that I think might be a little controversial is House Aaron. Again, I don't think he hates them, but I think they're very concretely his least favorite great house, or at least the great house that he is the least interested in, given the fact that they really don't have as much lore and history as these other houses in the Seven Kingdoms, as each noble house has a fairly distinct background and backstory. The Aarons are known as the purest of Andal nobility, but I would also make the argument that the Andals as a people are one of the groups that Martin is very much less interested in, especially when you compare them to the First Men, the Children of the Forest, or the Valyrians. I also think that the main series is kind of indicative of this, in the fact that the only Aaron that is alive there is a child whose main trait is that he is about to die at all times. And additionally, beyond that, the heir to the Aaron household is Harry the Heir, which is further a tongue twister, but he is also depicted in the Winds of Winter Elaine sample chapter as kind of a douche. So overall, it seems as though this isn't a house that he necessarily dislikes too much. It's just kind of the least favorite of the great houses. Another house that Martin doesn't seem to care for is House Florent, one of the more prominent families in the Reach. They claim descent from Garth Greenhand, and they have a number of fairly important characters throughout the main series, but all of those main characters are just jerks who are awful to be around. Stannis' camp is full of Florents. They're one of the few houses that supports him very much initially, given the fact that Selyse Florent is his wife and queen. So her family is kind of bound into this, but Selene herself is just really unpleasant all the time, and her uncle, I believe, Axel Florent, who serves as a very close advisor to Stannis, is also a jerk and kind of the antithesis to Davos throughout his chapters in especially A Storm of Swords. And we eventually hear that Axel was burned at the stake to give them good winds when they are sailing northward, which is fairly ironic given the fact that he has fully converted to this faith of the Red God. They do seem pretty fervent in this belief as well, and they are very willing to burn people at the stake if they disagree with them. So overall, they do seem to be quite a bit disfavored in Martin's eyes. And similarly to Rosby, they do have some fairly distinct physical features, most notably that they have very large and prominent ears that other characters often remark on. And additionally, they're just generally not the best to look at. I think the Boltons are the most, like, outright, at first blush, villainous houses the series has, full stop. We don't have a ton of Boltons in the main series as it stands, but the two that we do have are quite notable. Roose and Ramsay Bolton are very much opposite ends of, like, the evil spectrum between chaotic evil and lawful evil, but overall these characters do seem to be just embodiments of cruelty and the antithesis of all the Starks were. And I do think they were intended as this kind of foil for House Starks, the vampires to the Starks werewolves, if you will. And I think that it very much is intended to be something that is going to be overthrown in the retaking of the North, so we can have a purely cathartic moment with the Starks reclaiming their ancestral seat from this evil, evil house. With that said, we don't know that all Boltons were always evil. We also hear about Domeric Bolton, who is Roose's trueborn son, who ends up getting killed maybe by Ramsay, probably by Ramsay, who sounds like a swell guy from all we hear of him. So there is some depth there, but they are mostly intended as villains. I also want to ask, are there any houses that you particularly dislike? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel. This one might get me shot by my good friend Fantasy Haven, but the Freys are pretty clearly one of Martin's least favorite houses. I think it is a more complex picture, though, at least as it was initially. I think the Freys in the main series have started out as a very much predominantly evil or evil adjacent. This is sort of an instance of an entire family being cast in the shadow of one patriarch, and that patriarch is Walder Frey, who is very bad. We get very few Freys who are just generally good in the series. We get Oliver, Rob Squire, and a few of the more kind of out there Freys who aren't directly tied in with things like the Red Wedding. But I think that Martin kind of realized this and wanted to show more depth in the family in his later materials, specifically in Fire and Blood. We see some more depth to the Freys by way of them siding with the good guys, the Blacks in the Dance of the Dragon, who I think Martin very much thinks are the good guys according to his interviews on the subject. But we get characters like Sabbath of Frey, who are these great heroes and really cool people. So that kind of balances against the Freys in the present, showing that this family is kind of reflecting the people at its head at any given time. But in the main series, Frey does kind of generally mean evil, at least if we're statistically weighing the number of morally good Freys versus the ones that did the whole Red Wedding thing. I also just don't like that they bully Bran, the two Walders, so I'm not a fan of that. We arrive at another house I've done a video on in the past, that being House PEAKE, the peak performance. I think that House PEAKE are kind of near the peak of Martin disliking a house, but kind of in the opposite way that the Freys are. So the Freys get more depth in Fire and Blood, whereas the Peaks are one of the most outright villainous houses in Fire and Blood. I'll get to that in a second, but getting into the origins of House PEAKE, they are also from the Reach. They also claim descent from Garth Greenhand, and they used to have 3 castles. They now only have 1 castle. They are one of very few houses to successfully kill a Targaryen king, which is an impressive feat of villainy, if I have to say so. And I also think they have very much grown as this kind of villainous force as Martin has written the series, as they really aren't mentioned until one of the Dunk and Egg stories, and they kind of grow from there with more and more mentions coming again and again. Most recently in A Dance with Dragons, there are Peakes in the Golden Company, and in Fire and Blood, we get Unwin Peake, the greatest character in fiction, who comes in at the end of the Dance with the Dragons and just, pisses everybody off and does a lot of nepotism and really isn't great. But he is a really fun character to witness, and I hope they didn't cut him from House of the Dragon. So we'll see. I don't know. They cut Nettles, who's also a great character, so I don't know. I'm a little worried. I also want to give a shout out to some houses that I think just have funny names that he's kind of dunking on, like House Shet and House Lips, both of whom appear in the Elaine sample chapter for The Winds of Winter. The Lips one I mostly say because the guy's first name is Ossifer Lips, which is like, I don't know, ass for lips. It's kind of funny, and I feel bad for both of these houses. We now arrive at House Bracken. I discussed in my Martin's favorite houses video that generally people say if you want to look at what side is viewed as correct in a conflict, look at what side the Blackwoods are on. The Blackwoods and the Brackens have this ancestral family feud that dates back further than anyone could possibly remember. It sort of comments on the nature of history and the way these cycles repeat themselves, that this kind of cycle of people thinking they deserve vengeance against the other just kind of perpetuates itself and keeps ping-ponging back and forth. And we saw that in action in House of the Dragon, which, I don't know, could be another source of Martin's frustration with the show, given that he got into all of the butterfly stuff. But season 2 also showed the Brackens in a more favorable light than the Blackwoods, as the Blackwood was doing all these war crimes to the Riverlands generally, but mostly to the Brackens. So really weird to see in terms of how the world tends to shake out, as the Brackens are typically painted as the far less sympathetic branch by George Martin. Even in Fire and Blood, they are the ones that are on the side that Martin doesn't agree with in pretty much every conflict, including Maegor's rebellion and what have you. I guess Maegor wasn't rebelling, he was on the throne. It was Aegon the Uncrowned who was rebelling, but I digress. That's semantics. I have to ask, what do you think? Did I miss any very obvious houses that Martin is also not a fan of? I did stick to Westeros. I'm sure there are groups in Essos he doesn't like as well. Let me know in the comments down below, and when you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. I'll be back in the near future for many videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, Game of Thrones, all that stuff. I am now done with my second year of law school, so I will have many more videos coming for you this summer. I do have a summer job, but I am excited to also be able to focus more on some YouTube stuff. Hopefully I'll stream a little more in this little break I have before I have work starting up. So thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.